Hello everyone. So today we'll be talking about chapter 10, which looks at two different areas which are interrelated but distinct nonetheless. So the first of these is motivation and the second of these is emotion, right? Now, when we talk about the first of these, right, which is motivation, right? So, the first question that I would like to ask all of you is that what comes to your mind when you think about motivation? What comes to my mind is sort of looking at different kinds of behaviors, right? And wondering why this person would be doing what they're doing. So, for example, you look at someone who is, climbing up a dangerous mountain like the K2, right? And you wonder why is it that they do what they're doing, or you see someone who has dedicated their life to studying wildlife and they live amongst animals and they sort of expose themselves to all kinds of danger, right? And you wonder what is the reason for this kind of behavior, right? So when you're talking about reason, right, you're looking at what is driving their behavior, right? So that is where you're sort of looking at the idea of motivation, right? Now, there are different theories that really try to explain what motivation is about, right? There are actually two kinds of theories. The first of these are what we call drive theories, right? And the second of these are what are called incentive theories. There are sometimes, other ways of sort of putting these as well. Let me sort of lay out what these really are about. But drive theories are mostly called push theories of motivation, whereas incentive theories are mostly called pull theories of motivation. Now, what exactly does this mean? So, first, let's take a look at what we call a drive theory. So, what a drive theory assumes is that there is a particular drive which is motivating behavior. Now, what is a drive? The way that a drive is defined is that it is an internal state of tension. And what this internal state of tension does is that it pushes the organism to reduce this tension, right? So there's a fundamental assumption behind all kinds of drive theories, right? And that assumption is basically that organisms, right, they basically want to stay in a state of homeostasis or equilibrium, right? So organisms want something that we call homeostasis, which basically is a state of equilibrium, right? And when that equilibrium is disturbed, right, what happens is that that results in an internal state of tension, and that internal state of tension then pushes the organism to reduce the tension, to indulge in any kind of activity that would reduce this tension, right? So let's go over this again. So drive theory basically assumes that all organisms want to, stay in a state of homeostasis, which is basically a state of equilibrium. If that state of equilibrium is disturbed, right? So if you have any kind of disturbance to this equilibrium, that results in there being a drive, which is an internal state of tension that pushes the organism to reduce, this tension, to indulge in some kind of activity that would reduce this tension. Now let's look at an example. So what you have here is, one example of homeostasis. Let me go back and fix the spelling here as well. So this is what it is, right? So you have an example here which looks at temperature regulation, right? And basically what you have is that, if the temperature of the body becomes too high, right? What happens is that, your blood vessels in the skin dilate to remove heat, right? And what that results in is that the person starts sweating, and the activity that you would most likely indulge in is that you would, for example, if you're wearing a sweater, you would remove that sweater, or if you have the heater turned on, you would turn down the heater, right? So it's basically that, when your temperature is too high, right, your equilibrium is disturbed. And because that equilibrium is disturbed, then your body reacts in a particular way, in the sense that your blood vessels in the skin dilate, right? And you also act in a particular way, right, in order to restore that particular equilibrium, because this is where that equilibrium exists, right, which is the comfortable range for body temperature, right? On the other extreme of this, if you look at if temperature becomes too low, right, what happens is that the blood vessels in the skin constrict, so they become thinner, right, to conserve heat, and a person starts to shiver. And the activity that you can do, or the behavior that you can have here, is that you either turn up the heater or you put on a sweater or a jacket or whatever it is that you have on hand, right? So this is basically, trying to explain what happens in terms of, temperature regulation when we're talking about how the body regulates its temperature, right? And you're doing this using the drive theory of motivation, right? But looking at this theory, it must have occurred to you that not all actions can be explained by drive theories, right? And that is where we sort of get incentive theories. So, what exactly is an incentive theory? Now, a lot of times, you are extremely full, you've gone to a restaurant with friends and you're extremely full, but you still want to have dessert, or you still want to have ice cream. Now, is that because, there's some sort of internal tension that, you're feeling hungry? It's not because of that, right? But rather it's because you really like the ice cream, or it's because they're perhaps introducing a new flavor that you really want to try out, right? Or for example, you do something like this, that you study for an exam, right? Now, is that because you have an internal state of tension? That's not, normally true. You study for an exam because you want a grade, right? So what is that grade? That grade basically is an incentive, right? So an incentive, if you try to define it, it's anything outside of the organism, right? But which has the ability, right? It's outside of the organism, but it has the ability to influence behavior. So it's any sort of external factor that has the ability to influence behavior, right? So, in this case, the ice cream is the incentive, right? In this case, right, the A grade that you will receive, right, that is an incentive, right? So, an incentive is something that lies outside of the organism, whereas when we go back and we look at drive theories, right? So a drive is something that lies within the organism, right? It's an internal state of tension, whereas when we look at incentives, right, those are external factors. They are external to the organism, right? But they still have this ability to influence or direct behavior, right? And this is where we sort of go back to what we talked about, that, drive theories are push theories, that there's something within the organism that pushes the organism to behave in a particular way, right? Whereas incentive theories are more pull theories in the sense that there's something outside of the organism that pulls the organism towards itself, right? So this is basically what drive and incentive theories are about, right? Then there are other, sort of theories that take into account the process of evolution, and they're called the evolutionary theories of motivation. And what the evolutionary theories of motivation do is that they assume that all sorts of traits or all sorts of behaviors that human beings have, right? They have served some kind of adaptive value, which basically means that they have helped human beings in, the race of survival, right? So something like, let's suppose if you have something like aggression, right? Let's take this example. So the way that evolutionary theorists would explain aggressive behavior is that they would say that aggression has particular survival value or adaptive value, in the sense that, if you have members of species living together and one of these people is very aggressive, right? So they might come across as more dominating, right? And that might give them a particular survival or adaptive value, right? And because of that, this trait is then passed on to subsequent generations, right? And therefore, the way that you explain it is that, it's evolved with human beings. The trait or the behavior, any behavior that you have in question, it's evolved because it was adaptive or because it served a particular adaptive value, right? So any sort of behavior, this is how evolutionary theories will make sense of it. That they will say that, this particular behavior must have some kind of survival or adaptive value, and that is why it has been passed on to subsequent generations, right? So these are basically what evolutionary theories regarding motivation are, right? Now we move on and we try to look at, some bases. When we look at, so one of the very basic motivators, right? And we look at different kinds of motivations. Let me show you that. So here we have, this table that looks at biological motives and social motives, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the first of these, which is the hunger motive, right? And try to sort of look at all sorts of biological and social basis for the hunger motive and try to explain where the motivation for hunger comes from, right? But there are all sorts of biological motives in human beings. So it's not just the hunger motive, there's the thirst motive, then you have the sex motive, you have the temperature motive, the sleep and rest motive, right? You might also have the aggression motive as a biological motive. Then you also have social motives in humans, and we'll talk about the first of these as well, which is the achievement motive, which is the need to excel. Then you also have the affiliation motive, which is the need to form social bonds. Then you have the autonomy motive, which is the need for independence. The order motive, which is the need for orderliness, tidiness, organization, right? So all of these different motives do exist in human beings. Obviously, they exist to, certain or differing levels in different individuals. So even when we have something like the achievement motive, right? So different people have a varying needs to excel, um, and they might have different areas in which they wish to excel. So there are individual differences with regards to that. But when we talk about something like hunger, right? So the motive of hunger, that is something that is very universal to human beings. And people might feel hungry to varying degrees, but everyone feels hungry at, one point or the other, every day, really, right? So basically, what we do next is that we try to explore the motivation of hunger and we try to look at certain biological bases regarding the hunger motive. So one of the first things that we look at is what was understood as being the basis of hunger, right? So what it was assumed was that stomach contractions, right? Because one of the things that you might notice is that when you're hungry, right, you might feel your stomach contracting. So one of the assumptions became that stomach contractions caused hunger. Now, later, this theory was debunked because what you saw was that, in certain cases, a person's stomach might have to be removed, right? And what you saw in those cases was that even if the stomach was removed, a person still could feel hungry, right? So then definitely hunger is not a function of stomach contractions, right? So this theory was debunked. And then researchers started to look more into the role of the brain in modulating hunger, right? And when they started researching on the role of the brain in modulating something like hunger, what they found out was that the hypothalamus, right, played a major part in the regulation of hunger, right? Here, what you can see is the hypothalamus, right, which is a structure right here, right? This is what you have. And here you have, a more detailed view. So this is a much more detailed view, right? And there are these different sort of um, points within the hypothalamus, right? So this is what we call the lateral hypothalamus, right? And researchers, what they saw was that if they destroyed this region in rats, right, what happened is that if this region was destroyed, the lateral hypothalamus, what that resulted in was that rats lost all interest in eating. It was as if their hunger center had been destroyed, right? Whereas if you have the other bit of it, which is the ventromedial nucleus of the hypothalamus, if this was lesioned, right, or destroyed, what you had as a result was that these rats, they ate excessively, right, and gained a lot of weight. It was as if you know, they were no longer told by the brain when their stomachs were full, right? So it was as if the brain could no longer give them signals that they were full and they kept eating and eating and eating, right? So, this is very interesting in the sense that if you destroy one part of the brain, which is of the hypothalamus, to be more specific, you have, this sort of reaction that, there's loss of interest in eating. Whereas if you destroy another part of the hypothalamus, there's an opposite sort of reaction that an organism keeps eating, keeps eating, keeps eating. But further research has sort of complicated this and showed that there's not one sort of factor at play. It's not that we can completely say that the hypothalamus is all that there is that is crucial in the regulation of hunger. There are so many other factors involved as well. Because what we have is that further research has sort of complicated it further. So further research also showed that the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus also plays a part. Then you also had research which implicated hormones such as serotonin to be playing a very important part in the regulation of hunger, right? And not just serotonin, there's another neurotransmitter by the name of neuropeptide Y, which also seems to have some sort of role to play in the regulation of hunger, right? So yeah, so you sort of shifted from looking at, when we talk about the brain, looking at anatomical structures. This is what we were doing when we were looking at different aspects of autonomy with regards to the hypothalamus. So this is what we were doing here, right? So we shifted from doing this to looking at more of neural circuits, right, that might control hunger. So this is the current way of thinking about the modulation of hunger and how that is controlled in the brain. But there are different processes that are responsible for this as well, and different theories have been put forth. So, for example, one of those is that it's actually, the level of glucose, right, which controls hunger. So if your glucose level is high, right, so you will feel less hungry because there are these structures in the brain which are called glucostats, right, and these are sensitive to the amount of sugar that is present, amount of glucose that is present in the blood, right? And they give the brain information regarding the amount of glucose that's present in the blood. And therefore, through this mechanism, there is, what we have, the regulation of hunger. I hope that all of you know what glucose is, right? Glucose is basically it's a simple sugar, right? And it's a wild source of energy. A simple sugar, sorry about that. So basically, these glucostats that you have are neurons that are sensitive to the level of glucose in the blood, right? But this also is not a complete view, because what you see is that glucose levels do not shift very dramatically over even the course of a day, and therefore you cannot explain why a person would feel hungry multiple times during a day through this theory alone, right? So this is also an incomplete theory. Then you also have the role of certain hormones such as insulin and something that we call leptin, right? So I'm sure that pretty much a majority of you might have heard about insulin. So basically, insulin is produced by the pancreas, and what it does is that it helps extract glucose from the blood, right? And it's basically when you have an inadequate supply of insulin, right? That is when diagnosed with diabetes, right? So what insulin does is that, whenever a person eats, you see a sudden rise in the levels of insulin that they have, right? Um, but recent research shows that it's not only when you've eaten. Even if you smell food, even if you look at food, there is a change in the level of insulin in your blood, right, in your body. So, insulin also seems to be implicated in the regulation of hunger. Then there's another hormone by the name of leptin, right? And what leptin does is that it tells our brain, right? It sort of informs the brain about the amount of fats that are stored in the body. right? And if the fat stores are high, right, when leptin levels are high, because leptin is basically it's produced by fat cells, right? So the more fat cells are there, the higher the level will be of the leptin, right? And then if leptin levels are high, right, what you see is that hunger seems to diminish. So what that means is that hunger seems to decrease, right? Um, in contrast to this, if leptin levels are low, then a person would feel more hungry than they would if leptin levels are high, right? So insulin and leptin are also in these ways, they also are implicated in the regulation of hunger. Then there are obviously situational factors as well that are present that also influence how much we eat, right? So, one of the first of these, when we talk about situational influences, is palatability, or how good or how delicious the food is, right? So, if the food is very delicious, you will eat more, right? Then you also have something like variety, which is a situational factor. So the more variety that you have, right? So higher the variety, the more you will end up eating. So this is what happens when you go to a buffet, right? And you end up eating a lot because there is a huge variety of the amount of food that you have, right? Then there are other factors such as, let's suppose, the presence of others. And what research shows is that you tend to eat more in the presence of others, right? If you're around friends, you tend to eat a lot more compared to if you're alone, right? Then you also have something like the quantity that is available, right? And this has a lot to do with portion size, right? So if, for example, you go to McDonald's and you get an upsized meal and you end up with lots of fries and lots of Coke, then obviously you will be eating a lot more, right? Than if you had a smaller quantity to begin with, right? So situation factors or situational influences are also extremely important. Then obviously you have other factors such as the role of stress. The role of stress is also extremely important. One of the things that you find is that in certain people, if there's higher stress, they tend to eat a lot more. In certain others, if there's greater stress, they tend to eat lesser. So, there are individual differences with regards to stress as well. But it definitely does have, it does play a role in how much we eat. In our eating behavior, stress seems to play a very major part, right? Then, this is something that will continue in our next video, but there are learned preferences with regard to food as well, in the sense that, and these are, there's a lot of role of culture here. So, for example, people of our culture may not be so, sort of comfortable eating raw fish or something like sushi, but someone who's grown up in Japan, someone who's grown up in China, they might not have a problem with it at all. So not role of language, but role of culture. Sorry about that, right? So, the culture that you have regarding, what sort of foods are preferred in your particular culture, those also play a part in what sort of food you like to eat and what sort of food you consume, right?